Hello, welcome everybody to Walk in the Park. My name is Tony Ingram, and today's episode is, let's see, get up the screen here. Episode 64, recorded on December 18th, 2013. If you want to see all my episodes, you can go to my vid blog at walkinpark.com. Okay, so the last couple of weeks, we have been discussing invasive species. For instance, emerald ash borer, which is threatening to come and kill all our ash trees. It's going to do that, as a matter of fact. So we talked quite a bit about that. Before that, we talked about the hemlock woolly adelgid, another insect which is killing our hemlock trees in our gorges and elsewhere around here. So now we're going to talk about an aquatic invasive species that folks in the Ithaca area, most of them know about and have gotten familiar with, and that is Hydrilla. So this is a map here showing the southern end of Cayuga Lake and Cayuga Inlet in the lower left, Fall Creek. These are areas that have been infested by Hydrilla, which is a very pernicious invasive aquatic weed. So to learn more about Hydrilla, we are going to go to, actually I went to a conference on the Finger Lakes Research Conference at Hobart and William Smith College at the Finger Lakes Institute, run by the Finger Lakes Institute on November 15th. And there were research reports from all over the Finger Lakes. And James Balyszak of Ithaca, of the Hydrilla Task Force in Ithaca, spoke for about 15 minutes and gave us an update on the entire Hydrilla story. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go take a look at that. And the video quality is a little sketchy. It was done with a small pocket camera from a distance, and I boosted the volume some, but the information's good, so we'll bring that right up.
My name is James Balyszak. I'm the Hydrilla Program Manager for the Hydrilla Task Force of the Cayuga Lake watershed. And of course, our panel today is talking about the threat of invasive species, both locally and regionally on a statewide scale. So the project that I'm involved with and the Hydrilla Task Force is involved with, of course, the discovery of Hydrilla in the Cayuga Inlet, which was discovered in August of 2011. And since the discovery, the Hydrilla Task Force came together quite quickly to address this infestation. Of course, Hydrilla being known as one of the worst aquatic invasive species in the planet, basically. I'll start off by touching on the impacts that invasive species can have. And again, I'm going to focus a little bit more on aquatic invasive species, as that's the background where they're coming from. But we know that invasive species can have adverse impacts to native habitats, basically outcompeting native plant and animal species, displacing them, establishing a monoculture, and degrading the overall native habitat. There's also adverse impacts to recreation. We're seeing, especially with Hydrilla infestation, restricted access for boating, swimming, fishing, canoeing, kayaking, you name it. Anything that people would be doing to recreate in the water body is being negatively impacted. We're basically losing those best uses for the water bodies. We also have negative impacts to municipal water sources, where an invasive infestation can actually degrade the overall water quality, and it can also impact these municipal water intakes and processing structures. So you'll see that has kind of a domino effect. As these structures are impacted, you'll have greater costs to the municipalities and thus the taxpayers. We also see negative impacts to tourism and business, especially ones that depend directly on waterfront access. You know, if you have a boat rental company or a canoe kayaking company, if they're not able to access the water body due to an invasive infestation, they're going to lose money, and that has trickle-down effects to the community as well. And then lastly, I'll just touch on property values. Say if you actually were having a property or a house within an area that's infested, sometimes you'll actually see a decrease in the overall property value because that's basically a negative aesthetic appeal of that property. So having mentioned all of these adverse impacts that invasive species can have, we definitely know that action must be taken when invasive infestation is found. That is a clear objective that needs to be obtained. So having said that, knowing that we need to react and form a response to these invasive infestations, I'd like to kind of preface the remainder of this presentation by saying that without sound science and research backing our response, there really can't be any success. We can't go out there kind of willy-nilly or just doing whatever we think is right without the science to back it up. Basically, our strategies and response, it needs to be calculated, and there needs to be strategy behind it. So I'll move in a little bit of greater depth on how this science and research can support our efforts, starting off with science and research forming the foundation for our basic understanding of the key biological features of these invasive species, as well as the specific threats posed by those. And now I'll focus a little bit more on what the plant we're dealing with in the Cayuga Inlet, which is Hydrilla reticulata. Now, with its release, introduction into the United States in the 1950s and 1960s via Florida, and this again came from the aquarium trade, not much was known about the plant during that time period, and that lack of knowledge actually allowed it to spread to a point where it reached a critical mass. And now we see areas like Florida are spending roughly $20 to $30 million a year to only manage hydrilla on a local scale. Eradication is no longer feasible. So it was that lack of knowledge that kind of led to the explosion in areas such as Florida. Since then, however, there's been a great deal of research on this plant, specifically the dioecious biotype, which is what we see in the warmer climates. Up here in the northern climates where it's colder, we see the monoecious variety, which more information is still needed, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But basically, through research, we've discovered that the plant grows in waters of 25 to 30 feet in depth. So now, knowing that, we know which areas are susceptible to possible growth. We also came to discover some of the distinguishing characteristics, which be 4 to 8 leaves arranged in a whorl pattern, a spiraling pattern around a central stem. This is helping us to identify legitimate hydrilla infestations as opposed to possible lookalikes or natives, such as LOD, which has 3 leaves. There's also the fact that it has bright green pointed leaves with serrated edges. This allows us just further identification, further background information, so we can decipher a true hydrilla infestation. We also know that for propagation, it produces turions and tubers. Turions are basically vegetative buds that the plant will form above the sediment. You can kind of think of it like a pine cone, which would break off and float on to produce a new plant in the future. And then also tubers, which is the structure on the bottom side there, that would be produced under the sediment. That's a specialized root structure that would allow the plant to remain viable and dormant underneath the sediment, only to sprout later. We also know that the plant is brittle, that environmental disturbances or human disturbances can break the plant up quite easily, and that the stem and leaf fragments actually are able to propagate and sprout new plants. So that's another mode by which it spreads. And we now know that it has a very rapid growth rate on the order of several inches per day, and it can grow in environments of low light and low nutrients. So when we factor all this information together, this hard scientific data behind the plant, we now know what we're dealing with. We have a better idea of the enemy that we have to face. So basing our response actions off of the science behind the plant, we can now use the science and research to develop an effective response and assess its efficacy. So the 2 key features which I mentioned are turions and tubers, the main modes by which this plant spreads. Now, in our project, we know that we want to ensure that hydrilla doesn't produce these structures in order to propagate and spread beyond the Cayuga Inlet. So, knowing that we need to address these key features of hydrilla, we implement monitoring and sampling within our project, and this is within the treatment area as well as outside the treatment area. And this is to look at the overall hydrilla population, to delineate the infestation, but most importantly, to properly time our treatments. Our goal is to actually allow those tubers to germinate. We want them to germinate so they start expending their energies, they send shoots above the sediment, and then at the proper time, we will apply our herbicide treatments to kill the vegetative growth above the sediment. Essentially, we cause the tubers to expend all their energy, they're no longer viable, but we've also killed the plant before it has had a chance to produce any more tubers or turions. So, knowing the science behind the plant and how it propagates allows us to better time our treatments so they are more effective. In conjunction with the treatments, we also do further sampling and recording of the data as far as the native plant community, the hydrilla population, total tuber population, the effects that we're having on that. And all of this data that we're gathering is put together, and this helps us to further collaborate with organizations and groups on a local, regional, and statewide level. And by providing that information to them, we can better help those groups and those task force to address the infestations in their area if they do have them. And this also helps us to focus our education and outreach activities while at the same time supporting legislation and research. And now that I've touched on education and outreach, I'll focus on that a little bit, and the fact that the science and research behind our project and the specific plant that we're dealing with forms the foundation for the specific targeted education and outreach that we're going to conduct within our community, with our stakeholders, with representatives, with citizen scientists and volunteers. So that science, the hard science and data behind this plant and our project helps us to focus our education and outreach. Now, I will say for each program, each invasive species program, it's going to differ. Your education and outreach is going to differ. So what we see locally and what we've implemented is a presence at local events and community hotspots, like the farmers market here, where we provide educational and outreach materials that contains that data and that scientific data and research that we want to provide and disseminate to the public. So basically, they're on the same page that we are. We want them to know everything that we know. In addition, there's also identification classes for volunteers or just members of the community. So basically, attendees at this event here, this was an invasive species ID training. They received specialized training to look for suspicious growth, not just hydrilla, but invasive species in general. We also disseminate information to the public through our primary website, stophydrilla.org, which is run by the Cooperative Extension. This provides information on our project, updates, developments, also monitoring and sampling data with regards to the plant community and water quality. And then recently this year, social media sites, social networking sites that can provide quick updates, daily, weekly basis, but also update the public on any upcoming events where they could either participate or come and get information and ask questions. Two initiatives that were conducted and really expanded this year were the Hydrilla Hunters, which are managed by the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network, and the Cayuga Lake Floating Classroom, which conducted hydrilla plant survey cruises. So basically, these two initiatives provided hands-on monitoring experience to volunteers. They received proper training on invasive species identification. They know what to look for, and as Richard mentioned, that's very helpful in having more eyes out there. The task force has a limited size, and we have limited resources. And if we can bring the community in, we can bring in volunteers and citizen scientists, they can help broaden our impact and bring in and generate usable data based on sound science and sampling techniques, which can be processed and provided to a broader range, mainly on a statewide level through IMAP invasives or the generation of reports from those localities. And also, as Richard mentioned, this gives the volunteers and the scientists leadership roles, but a sense of accomplishment and involvement. When something is affecting the community and the environment that people live in, they like to know that they can do something, that they can participate in a meaningful way and provide scientifically backed data that's going to help our project. So again, being able to bring in these volunteers and citizen scientists has really helped our efforts. And last, I'll touch on science and research being the foundation for understanding how we can best affect change on all these scales, local, regional, and statewide scale. And this is through the formation of legislation and policy. Now that we know that the major mode of spread, especially of hydrilla and other invasive species, is through human vectors, whether it's through shipping, trade, or commerce, or on a local level, we have the transport of invasive species between an infested water body, say here, and then that person launches in a nearby one that's not infested. That's an easy mode of spread, especially for hydrilla. And then we have through the aquarium trade, or the sale from nurseries, the introduction of invasive species here. And this is how hydrilla was first introduced. Someone dumped their aquarium down in Florida. So knowing that that's the major mode of spread for invasive species, and that the threat of spread from current infestations is very high, as well as the reinfestation from areas that are already previously infested back into, say, our treatment area, we can now form our invasive species legislation that is going to target these specific root causes of where these invasive species are coming from. We want to restrict the sale, purchase, possession, propagation, introduction, importation, and transport of these species. So, through the science behind the species themselves, we can target the legislation. I think I'm close to time here, so what I'll do is I'll finish up just by saying that invasive species control and eradication and management is going to be a long-term effort that's going to involve all of the groups that I've mentioned here today. We have the management groups, scientists and experts, volunteers and citizen science, legislators, and at the core of this is going to be that science and research, which is going to form the basis for our management response, our targeted education and outreach, further collaboration. I put research on here twice because we will recognize areas where we are lacking information. In our current case, our project, that's a lack of information on the monoecious biotype of Hydrilla. And through our efforts, we're gaining more and more information. We're better understanding the nature of Hydrilla, monoecious Hydrilla here, and how to better treat it. And then, of course, focusing our legislation on targeting the root cause of how these invasive species get here, how they propagate, and how they spread. And we'll take questions at the end, but thank you very much. There's my contact information.
Okay, so Hydrilla has also been found in Fall Creek, not just Cayuga Inlet, but this year it was found in Fall Creek and in a southeast corner of Cayuga Lake. The here, I'll just flip some pictures here. Initial findings on August 21st, 2013, while conducting extensive surveys in the southern end of Cayuga Lake, survey crews from Racine Johnson Aquatic Ecologists discovered 2 small patches of growing hydrilla in the southeast corner of the lake. The first patch in the southeast corner was found off the shore from the visitor center in about 30 inches of water. And the, the second patch, consisting of 2 smaller patches that came from a single plant, was found further to the north and was discovered during subsequent sampling. It was found to be growing in 40 inches of water. The Hydrilla Task Force removed all the plant mass above the sediment in each patch by hand. Fine mesh barriers were installed to cordon off each patch. Divers working inside the barriers and on the lake bottom surrounded the plant mass and carefully lifted it by hand. Any fragments that broke off were caught by barriers and collected. Sandy bottoms in this portion of the lake, coupled with warm water temperatures, allowed divers to work slowly and without gloves, minimizing sediment disturbance. After the plant mass was removed, the sediment was sampled for tubers. Benthic barriers were set in place atop each of the patches until the next growing season. So the hydrilla that was found in Fall Creek was treated this fall, and they wrapped up their surveys and treatment and so forth by December. But now we're going to flip to Florida. As a matter of fact, Florida is where hydrilla was first introduced in the United States, but we're going to talk about endangered species. In this case, we're going to go down to the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. You can see the picture there. It's near Naples, Florida. And we're going to watch a video from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, so what was going on there? They wrote on December 13th, 2011, a collared male Florida panther known to biologists as FP-183 approaches a log on Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge in Naples, Florida. Elusive and rare, this footage allows us to observe the marking habits of these majestic cats. Footage submitted by Kevin Godsey, project leader at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They did give a correction that was not marking the log with saliva, but with its cheek glands. So now we're going to go to the next one, recorded on December 19th, 2011. Okay, so we'll go and look at that next video. They said for one recorded on December 28th when Panthers come back. Let's see, to this one. Looks like I made an error there. We got to get to the third one here. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and then finally we'll go to the last one here, see if I can get that up here correctly. Okay, and then finally I'm going to do another video by the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park, where I think one of the panthers. There's actually a pair of them paired up now. This was taken in April of this year, 2013. One of the panthers was one of the first one that was shown one shown in the first video here, but this time it's a pair. So we'll go to Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park. You can see that dot in the lower left of the Florida there. And we'll go there. Okay, so that's extremely rare footage of the Florida panther at National Wildlife Refuge and a state park in southwest Florida near Naples. And I've been down there in the Everglades going out looking where Florida panthers been seen. Of course, I've never seen one. So, well, that's all we've got time for today. Episode 64, December 18th was recorded. So have a good week.